I sat in the hospital bed, my heart pounding as I clutched the phone. Greg, my husband, was on his way to pick up my things from the car. He didn't know what was inside my overnight bag, the evidence that could unravel everything. My secret affair, hidden for years, might be exposed if he found it. I had to stop him, but it was too late. He'd already seen the bag. Anxiety washed over me. How much had he discovered? And what would he do when he realized what I'd been hiding for so long? My name is Sandy Lawrence, and I'm 42 years old. I've lived a life that many would envy on the outside, at least. I'm married to Greg Williams, a solid, dependable man who's always been there for me. He's a few years older than me, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that hold a calm patience. He works at a factory, managing systems, while I have a job as a buyer for an upscale clothing store. It's not the most glamorous, but it lets me travel to Boston every couple of weeks for work. Our daughter, Lisa, is 20 and just starting college. She's always been the glue that holds our little family together, the one thing that makes everything feel whole. Lisa is bright and ambitious, a blend of Greg's steadfastness and my outgoing nature. We have a nice home in a friendly neighborhood, a place where Greg and I have built our life over the past 22 years. Neighbors know us and we're regulars at the weekend get-togethers. But behind that perfect image, my life has been anything but perfect. I've always been a bit of a flirt, even when I was a teenager. My parents tried to keep me in line, but I was wild. I met my first love, Eric Thompson, when I was 18, and he was my everything. We dated through my senior year of high school until my parents caught us together. Eric went off to college, and I spent my last year of high school under strict watch. But the thrill of those secret meetings never left me. After high school, I went to college and quickly became known as the ultimate party girl. But then, I met Greg. He was serious, quiet, but kind-hearted. I fell in love with him, though I kept my past hidden, afraid he'd judge me. We started dating, going to out-of-the-way places where no one knew me. I was relieved he never questioned why I avoided more popular spots. Greg proposed after college, and I said yes. We had Lisa a year later, and our family seemed like a perfect picture. Greg found work, I settled into my job, and we eventually bought a home in a cozy suburb. Life settled into a rhythm, with me going on my buying trips and Greg staying back, taking care of things at home. But then, on one of those trips to Boston, I ran into Eric. It was like my past had come back to haunt me. All those old feelings surged back, and before I knew it, we were spending the night together. I lied to Greg, telling him I had to meet a client. It felt thrilling, like those wild teenage years all over again. That night with Eric turned into a habit, a secret affair that we kept up for the next 12 years. Greg never suspected a thing. He was always trusting, always believed me when I told him about my extended stays in Boston. He's the kind of man who sees the best in people, the kind of man you'd want by your side for a lifetime. And yet, I couldn't resist the pull of that secret life I'd built with Eric. Every time I saw Eric, we promised each other that we wouldn't mention our families. We kept our lives separate, treating our rendezvous as an escape from the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood. It made it easier to justify to myself, to pretend that I wasn't hurting anyone. But the guilt was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I convinced myself that I could keep both lives in balance. Greg, on the other hand, never seemed to notice my absences. He was too busy with work and caring for Lisa to question my frequent trips. He trusted me completely. Our relationship wasn't as passionate as it once was, but he treated me with respect and kindness, never once making me feel like he doubted me. Sometimes, I wished he would. Maybe if he'd questioned me or shown some jealousy, I wouldn't have continued my affair with Eric for so long. Things began to change one summer night at a neighborhood party. Greg had always been the friendly, laid-back guy, content to chat with the neighbors while I flirted with the husbands. That night, though, he was different, quiet, distant. He spent most of the evening talking to Teresa Morgan, a widow who lived down the street. I noticed how close they sat, how he held her hand as they talked. For the first time, I felt a pang of jealousy. I confronted him that night, asking if he was jealous of me flirting with the neighbors. He shrugged it off, saying he'd never been the jealous type, that if someone else could make me happier, he wouldn't stand in the way. It stung, hearing him say that. I wanted him to fight for me, to show that he still cared. Instead, he seemed resigned, like he'd already accepted the possibility of losing me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to focus more on Greg. I cooked his favorite meals, spent more time with him, and even suggested a weekend trip. But the thrill of seeing Eric still pulled me back. Our meetings in Boston continued, even though I told myself each time that it would be the last. Then came the accident. I had stayed too long with Eric, lost track of time, and rushed out without cleaning up. On the drive back, I crashed into another car. It wasn't a serious accident, but I ended up in the hospital for observation. And that's when everything began to unravel. My dirty panties, evidence of my betrayal, were in my overnight bag. And Greg, in his concern, had taken the bag from my car. As I lay in that hospital bed, I realized that I couldn't keep my double life hidden anymore. Greg was bound to find out, and when he did, our whole world would change. I'd spent so many years convincing myself that I could keep my secret forever, but now it felt like the end was near. Lying in the hospital bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what Greg might find. It was a long night, filled with worry and regret. When Greg finally arrived the next morning, he seemed normal, his face only showing concern for my injuries. He held my hand, kissed my forehead, and promised that everything would be all right. Relief washed over me. Maybe he hadn't discovered anything after all. I told myself I could keep pretending, that I could somehow cover up the evidence. But a gnawing anxiety settled in my chest, and I couldn't shake it off. When we got home, the first thing I did was search for my overnight bag, but it wasn't where I'd left it. I went through the house, desperately trying to find it. Had Greg moved it? Had he looked inside? My hands were trembling, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I tried to keep my panic from showing, but I could sense something different in the way Greg moved around the house. He was quiet, more reserved than usual, watching me closely as if he were waiting for me to slip up. A few days later, Greg asked me to sit down for a conversation. He had that serious look on his face, the one he wore when discussing finances or big life decisions. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to keep calm. Maybe he just wanted to talk about my recovery or some plans for the future. "Sandy, I found something in your overnight bag," he started, his voice even and controlled. I felt my blood run cold, my heart dropping into my stomach. He went on, "I didn't mean to snoop, but, well, when I went to the car after the accident, the bag was open. And there was something inside that I couldn't ignore." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I wanted to deny it, to make up some excuse, but Greg's expression made it clear that he already knew the truth. He continued, "I found your underwear, Sandy. And I know what it means." Tears filled my eyes, and I tried to reach out for his hand, but he pulled back. It was like a wall had sprung up between us, one that I couldn't tear down with apologies or explanations. "Greg, I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it, Sandy? Because I can't think of any reason why your underwear would look like that after a trip to Boston unless you were with someone else." His voice cracked, and I saw the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal that cut deep. It was like watching everything we'd built together fall apart right in front of me. For a moment, the silence between us was suffocating. I thought about trying to lie again, to cover it up, but I knew it was pointless. "It's true," I finally confessed, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I've been seeing someone else. But I never meant for you to find out. I never wanted to hurt you." Greg stared at me, disbelief and pain etched into every line of his face. "You've been lying to me for how long, Sandy? How long have you been?" He couldn't finish the sentence, like he couldn't bear to hear the answer. I wiped my tears away, forcing myself to speak. "It's been 12 years. I met him on one of my trips to Boston. We were together before you and I met, and then I ran into him again, and it just happened." 12 years. He repeated the words like they were poison on his tongue. "You've been lying to me for 12 years? And you never once thought to end it? You never thought about what this would do to me, to Lisa?" I flinched at the mention of Lisa. My stomach twisted with guilt. She didn't know any of this, and the thought of her finding out made me feel like I'd betrayed not just my husband, but my whole family. I thought I could keep it separate, I stammered, trying to explain the mess I'd made. I thought that if you never found out, it wouldn't hurt anyone. Greg stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the room, his hands clenching and unclenching. You thought you could keep it separate? He said bitterly. You've been lying to my face for over a decade, Sandy. You went to him every time you were on a work trip and then came back to our home, to our bed, acting like nothing was wrong. Do you know how that makes me feel? I could hear the anger rising in his voice, and it terrified me. Greg had always been calm, patient, but now he was a stranger. I tried to reach out to him again, desperate to fix this, to somehow make him understand. Greg, please, I know I've made a terrible mistake. I'll end it with him. I'll never see him again. Just, don't leave me. Don't leave us. He stopped pacing, turning to look at me with a cold, distant expression that I'd never seen before. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Sandy, he said quietly. I don't even know if I want to try. That night, Greg moved into Lisa's old room. He left our bedroom and our bed, and it felt like he had left my life completely. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last 12 years in my mind. How had I let it go this far? How had I let myself destroy everything that was good in my life? In the days that followed, we barely spoke. Greg would come and go from the house, but it was like he was a ghost, slipping through the rooms without a word. Lisa noticed the tension between us immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How could I explain that her mother had been unfaithful, that I had betrayed her father so deeply? Then one evening, Greg called Lisa over for dinner. I didn't know what he planned to tell her, but I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't good. As we sat at the dining table, Greg cleared his throat and looked directly at our daughter. Lisa, there's something you need to know, he began, his voice steady but full of sadness. Lisa looked from him to me, her brow furrowed in confusion. What is it, Dad? You're scaring me. Greg took a deep breath and said the words I'd been dreading. Your mother has been unfaithful to me. She's been having an affair for years, and I just found out. Lisa's face went pale, her mouth dropping open in shock. She turned to me, her eyes wide with hurt and disbelief. Mom, is that true? Have you really been cheating on Dad? Tears filled my eyes as I nodded, unable to find the words. I'm so sorry, Lisa. I never meant for you to find out like this. I never wanted to hurt you. Lisa pushed back her chair, standing up so quickly that it toppled over. How could you do this to us, Mom? How could you do this to Dad? Her voice cracked, and I could see the tears streaming down her face. I thought you and Dad had the perfect marriage. I looked up to you, and now I don't even know who you are. She turned to Greg, her face crumpling. Dad, I'm so sorry. I can't believe she did this to you. To us. She reached out to him, and Greg pulled her into a hug. They stood there, father and daughter, while I watched from across the table, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. After Lisa left that evening, Greg sat me down again. His face was set, like he'd already made a decision. I don't know if we can fix this, Sandy, he said, his voice low and weary. I don't know if I even want to try. But I need time to think about what I'm going to do. I can't just pretend this never happened. I nodded, swallowing back the lump in my throat. Take all the time you need, Greg. I'll do anything to make this right. But deep down, I knew that I had shattered something between us that could never be repaired. Greg spent more and more time away from the house, visiting friends or staying late at work. When he was home, he stayed in Lisa's old room, avoiding me whenever he could. The silence between us was suffocating, and every time I tried to talk to him, he'd brush me off or leave the room. One evening, I overheard him on the phone, speaking to someone in hushed tones. My heart sank when I heard the name, Teresa. I realized then that he'd found someone to confide in, someone who wasn't me. The thought made me sick with jealousy, but I couldn't blame him. He needed someone to help him through the pain I'd caused. I couldn't stand the loneliness, the emptiness of our home without Greg's warmth. I called Eric, desperate for some sense of comfort, but when I asked him to leave his wife and be with me, he turned cold. "You know I can't do that, Sandy," he said flatly. "I have my own family. I thought you understood that this was just fun." His rejection cut deeper than I expected, and I realized just how alone I truly was. The man I had risked everything for wouldn't stand by me, and my husband, my real husband, could barely look at me anymore. Desperate to win Greg back, I tried to be the perfect wife. I cooked his favorite meals, cleaned the house obsessively, and even suggested that we see a therapist together. But every attempt I made to bridge the gap between us was met with silence. He was polite, even civil, but there was no warmth, no affection in his eyes. Then, one Saturday afternoon, Greg dropped a stack of papers on the kitchen table. Divorce papers. My heart shattered all over again as I stared at the documents, the words blurring through my tears. "You've already spoken to a lawyer?" I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. Greg nodded. "I think it's for the best, Sandy. We both need a chance to move on." "But I don't want to move on," I protested. "I want to fix this. I'll do anything, Greg, please. Don't throw away what we had." He looked at me, his expression resigned. "I'm not throwing anything away, Sandy. You did that when you chose to keep lying to me for 12 years. I can't change what you did, and I can't pretend that it doesn't matter. I deserve better than this." With that, he left the house, leaving me alone with the divorce papers. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the signature line where my name was supposed to go. My life, my marriage, and everything I'd taken for granted were slipping through my fingers, and I had no one to blame but myself. When Greg left with those divorce papers, it felt like the final blow. I thought I had hit rock bottom, but I had barely scratched the surface. Each day after that, I woke up in an empty bed, wandering through a house that suddenly felt too big, too hollow. I could feel the emptiness pressing down on me, as if the walls themselves were caving in. It became harder and harder to get out of bed each morning, knowing I would face Greg's absence all over again. Days turned into weeks, and Greg's silence became unbearable. The only thing I clung to was the hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd realize that our years together meant something worth saving. But Greg seemed to become a different man, cold, distant, and calculating in a way I'd never seen before. The man who had once held me with so much love now looked at me like a stranger, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. One day, he called me into the living room. His voice was icy as he announced, "I'm seeing a lawyer again next week. I think it's time we discuss the division of our assets." I tried to keep my voice steady, even though I could feel the panic rising inside me. "We don't have to rush this, Greg. Maybe we could go to counseling, work through this together." He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think you get it, Sandy. I'm done with trying. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I want a clean break." I bit my lip, fighting back tears. But even as I listened to him speak, I saw something else lurking behind his cold demeanor, an anger that ran deeper than he was willing to show. It was like a storm brewing just beneath the surface, waiting to unleash itself. And then, slowly, I began to see the ways Greg was planning to make me pay for what I had done. It started small at first, little things, barely noticeable. He canceled my credit cards without telling me, leaving me embarrassed at the checkout counter. He forgot to pay a couple of bills in my name, so that debt collectors started calling. And every time something like that happened, I'd look at Greg, expecting him to be apologetic, to say it was an accident. But he never did. The real turning point came when Lisa found out that Greg was considering selling our house. I overheard them talking one afternoon when she came over. "Dad, why are you doing this so soon?" she asked, her voice edged with worry. "Are you sure this is what you want?" "I think it's time to let go of this place," Greg replied calmly. "There's no point in holding on to a home when it's full of lies." The words hit me like a slap in the face. He was taking the one stable part of our lives, our home, and turning it into a weapon. If he sold the house, I'd have nowhere to go. I realized that his plan was to strip away everything I had left, bit by bit. He didn't need to yell or scream to show me his anger. He was going to make me suffer in silence. I tried to confront him about it that night. You don't have to do this, Greg, I pleaded. You're hurting me, and you know it. You're taking away my home. Our home. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, his mouth set in a grim line. You took away my trust, Sandy. What's a house compared to that? I couldn't find the words to respond, so I watched as he walked away, leaving me standing in the empty hallway. That was when I realized that this was his version of revenge, not by throwing accusations or making a scene, but by dismantling everything we had built together, piece by piece. As the days went on, Greg's quiet vengeance became more deliberate. He took over all of our finances, insisting that he'd handle the sale of the house and the division of our assets. I knew it was within his rights, but it still felt like he was trying to cut me out of the picture entirely. It became clear that he intended to leave me with as little as possible. One evening, after yet another terse discussion about the house, Greg looked at me with a smirk. I've been talking to a friend of mine, he said, his voice casual, almost mocking. You remember Jim, right? He's an investigator. My blood ran cold. Jim had been Greg's friend for years, but I had never known him to be the type to get involved in other people's business. I tried to keep my voice steady. Why would you need to talk to an investigator, Greg? Oh, just curious about some things, he replied, leaning back in his chair. You see, Jim's been following you for months. He even took a little trip to Boston a while back. Caught some pretty interesting footage. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All those trips, all those nights with Eric and Greg had known the whole time. He must have seen everything, the hotel rooms, the secret meetings. I had thought I was being so careful, but Greg had been one step ahead of me. What are you going to do with it? I asked, barely able to keep my voice from shaking. Greg shrugged, his eyes never leaving mine. Nothing for now. I'm not interested in humiliating you, Sandy. But I thought you should know that I could. I could show it to Lisa or send it to Eric's wife, but I'm not going to. I'm going to let you live with the knowledge that I have that power over you. It was the worst kind of punishment, knowing that he could ruin my life, but choosing to hold back. It made me feel small, powerless, like I was constantly walking on eggshells around him. And I knew that's exactly what he wanted. The more I tried to reach out to Greg, the more he pushed me away. I watched as he started spending time with Teresa, the widow from down the street. It wasn't just friendly conversations anymore. They went out to dinner together, took long walks around the neighborhood. I even saw him laughing with her in a way that I hadn't seen in years. It twisted a knife in my chest every time I saw them together, but I couldn't say anything. What right did I have to be jealous after everything I'd done? It wasn't long before rumors began to spread among our neighbors. People talked about how Greg was moving on, how he had found someone new. And they talked about me too, whispered behind my back about my affair, about the scandal that had broken up our marriage. I felt their judgment every time I stepped out of the house, their eyes following me as if I were a criminal. I tried to ignore it, to act like it didn't bother me. But one evening, as I walked past the park where Greg and Teresa often sat together, I saw them holding hands. It felt like a knife twisting in my gut, and suddenly, I couldn't hold back my anger anymore. When Greg came home that night, I confronted him. Is that what you're doing now? I spat, my voice trembling with emotion. Holding hands with Teresa Morgan like some lovesick teenager? Are you trying to replace me? Greg raised an eyebrow, a cold smile spreading across his face. What does it matter to you, Sandy? You replaced me years ago, didn't you? His words cut deep, but I refused to back down. If you're going to be with someone else, then just say it. Don't keep dragging this out just to hurt me. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he spoke softly, almost kindly. You know, Sandy, I don't think you're in a position to lecture me about hurting people. All those years I trusted you, and you were sneaking around behind my back. Do you really think I owe you an explanation now? I clenched my fists, trying to hold back my tears. I couldn't argue with him. I had hurt him in ways I couldn't take back. And now, he was using that pain to make me feel just as small and helpless as I'd made him feel. As our divorce proceedings moved forward, Greg made sure to use every opportunity to remind me of the power he held over me. He refused to sell the house until the last possible moment, keeping me in limbo, never knowing when I'd have to pack up and leave. He delayed paperwork, missed appointments with the lawyer, and left me constantly on edge, wondering what he'd do next. One morning, I found a note on the kitchen table in Greg's neat handwriting. It read, "I'm going to be out of town for a few days. If you're still here when I get back, I'll make sure you regret it." I crumpled up the note, anger boiling inside me. I knew what he was trying to do, to push me to leave before he could, to make it seem like I was the one running away. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I stayed, even though every second in that house felt like a reminder of my failure. While Greg was gone, I spent hours pacing the empty rooms, feeling the weight of everything I had lost. I thought about calling Eric again, but I knew he wouldn't give me the answers I needed. He had already shown that he didn't care about me. Not really. I had been a thrill for him, a distraction from his own life, just like he had been for me. But Greg's threats, his cold indifference, had become my new reality. I realized that this wasn't just about revenge for him, it was about making me feel as powerless as he had felt when he found out about my betrayal. And I couldn't escape the feeling that I deserved it. I was standing at the window when Greg finally returned home that Friday evening. He walked in with a small, satisfied smile on his face, as if he had won some silent battle. He glanced around the house, and when he saw my bag still packed in the corner, he shook his head. "You're still here, huh?" I met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not leaving, Greg. Not until you tell me that's what you really want." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What I want, Sandy, is for you to understand what you've done. To understand that you can't just walk away from your mistakes without consequences." I swallowed hard, realizing that this was the heart of his revenge. It wasn't about getting even. It was about making me feel the weight of my choices, about making me see what I had thrown away. And maybe, deep down, it was also about making me hurt the way he had hurt. But as I looked into Greg's eyes, I wondered if this cycle of pain would ever end, or if we were both trapped in it, unable to move on. As the tension between Greg and me simmered, it felt like we were living in a state of constant war, each of us trying to outlast the other. But beneath the surface, I began to sense a shift. It wasn't just anger in Greg's eyes anymore. There was exhaustion too, a weariness that matched my own. We had both been living in the shadow of my betrayal, letting it define us. And I could see that neither of us had any fight left. One rainy evening, Greg called me into the living room. His expression was unreadable, but there was something softer in his voice when he spoke. "Sandy, this has to end. We can't keep tearing each other apart like this." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I'd been waiting for him to say something like this, but I'd never expected it to come with such finality. "So, what now?" I asked quietly, bracing myself for whatever came next. He let out a long sigh and glanced toward the window, where rain streaked down the glass. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely. But I also can't keep punishing you, or myself. It's time for both of us to move on." I felt a mixture of relief and sadness wash over me. His words were like a release, but they also marked the end of any hope I had of fixing what I had broken. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again? Even as friends?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He met my eyes, and for the first time in months, there was a hint of the man I had once known. "Maybe in time. But we both need to find ourselves again, away from this mess." We sat there for a while, just listening to the rain, neither of us knowing how to say goodbye. In the silence, I felt the finality of it all settle in. Greg wasn't going to come back to me, and I wasn't going to get a second chance. But in that moment, I realized that maybe I didn't deserve one. Maybe what I really needed was the chance to start over, to learn how to live with myself again. A week later, Greg moved out. I watched from the window as he loaded the last of his boxes into his car. He paused before getting in, looking up at me one last time. He raised a hand in a small wave, and I returned it, feeling tears sting my eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a gesture of peace, a truce after months of pain. After he drove away, I sat in the empty house, letting the quiet settle around me. It was over, and the future felt uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a tiny spark of hope, buried deep beneath the regret. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that I had to find a way to forgive myself, even if Greg never could. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, listening to the rain. It felt like a new beginning. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing for both of us.